Hello, and welcome to the PRC CIA review. My name is Wada Halak, and I'm on the development team here at PRC, and we're here to brief you about the changes to the IPPF that were effective on January 1st, 2017, and they will be effective for exam purposes on July 1st, 2017. Of course, we're here all at PRC to help you pass the CIA exam, and as we're going to see, the changes will not really significantly affect the way you've studied over the past couple of months, and we don't believe they will have significant impact on your next CIA exam. Now with this, let's start and go over some of these changes. Now, as you know, we as internal auditors are trying to position our function within the organization at the strategic level. We want to be there with the strategists, and to do so and to achieve the definition of internal auditing to add value to the organization, what the folks at the IIA did is they tried to do the changes in order to position the internal audit strategically and for the internal audit function to think strategically, to help the organization think strategically. Most of the changes, as you're going to see, are going to rotate around these two factors. Now, with that, let's start with some of the changes. What the IIA did is they added two new elements to the IPPF, to the International Professional Practices Framework for 2017. They added the mission of internal audit, which is way up there. It's higher than the definition. It's the mission of internal audit. And they added the core principles for the professional practice of internal auditing. As we're going to see when we cover those core principles, they're a compilation of a lot of things that existed, and they just added them to the IPPF. Now, the mission of internal auditing is a statement that describes what internal audit aspires to accomplish within an organization. The mission of internal auditing is to enhance and protect organizational value by providing risk-based and objective assurance, advice, and insight. This is the mission of internal audit as put forward by the IIA. Now, the second set of addition are the standards. And these are the core principles for the professional practice of internal auditing. They are elements that describe internal audit effectiveness. All core principles should be achieved for an internal audit function to be considered effective. And the core principles are as follows. The core principles for the professional practice of internal auditing, first is to demonstrate integrity, demonstrates competence and due professional care, is objective and free from undue influence, i.e. independent, aligns with the strategies, objectives, and risks of the organization, is appropriately positioned and adequately resourced, demonstrates quality and continuous improvement, communicates effectively, provides risk-based assurance, is insightful, proactive, and future-focused, and finally promotes organizational improvement. As we see, all these principles were there somewhere in the practice of internal auditing. They were there in the recommended guidance. They were there in the mandatory guidance. They were just compiled now, and they are referred to as the core principles for the professional practice of internal auditing. Now, where do these core principles fit in? As we knew, we had mandatory guidance, which were three things. Remember what they were? They were the definition of internal auditing, what is it? Exactly. The code of conduct or the code of ethics and the standards. Now, they added one on top of these mandatory guidance. So now it's the core principles for the professional practice of internal auditing, the definition of internal auditing, the code of ethics, and the standards. So these four become the new mandatory guidance for the professional practice of internal auditing. Let's see how that will impact the standards. 1. Standard 1000. Now, the standard used to be the purpose, authority, and responsibility of the internal audit activity must be formally defined in an internal audit charter consistent with the definition of internal auditing, the code of ethics, and the standards. Now, all these three are the mandatory guidance. So what happens now? Now the charter should be consistent with the mission of internal auditing, which is the first thing they added, and the mandatory elements of the IPPF, which are the core principles, the definitions, the code of ethics, the standards, and of course the definition of internal auditing. They just reordered that. Now the chief audit executive, from there on, nothing has changed. The second change pertains to the title. Now, recognition of the definition of internal auditing, the code of ethics, and the standards. Now they just collected them all, collectively refer to them as recognizing mandatory guidance in the internal audit charter. And in the standards, it says the mandatory nature of the core principles for the professional practice of internal auditing, the code of ethics, the standards, and the definition of internal auditing must be recognized in the internal audit charter. The chief audit executive should discuss the mission of internal audit, mission of internal audit, and the mandatory elements of the code of the international professional practice framework with senior management and the board. So now it's the mission and the mandatory guidance of the IPPF, which are comprised of the core principles, the code of ethics, standards, and the definition of internal auditing. Now, organizational independence. The internal audit activity must be free from interference in determining the scope of internal auditing, performing work, and communicating results. The addition is the chief audit executive must disclose such interference to the board and discuss the implications. In the past, when somebody did interfere, it was recommended to communicate such interference to the board. Now it's mandatory as part of the organizational independence standards. Now, a new standard has been added here, and that's the chief audit executive roles beyond internal auditing. Now, in the past, in the IPPF, it did state that in some cases, the chief audit executive might conduct in the future or might have conducted in the past roles beyond internal auditing. It's just a mandatory documentation in the standard there now, where the chief audit executive has or is expected to have roles and or responsibilities that fall outside of internal auditing. Safeguards must be in place to limit impairments to independence or objectivity. So these safeguards, they're variable. They could be anything from supervisory roles by the audit committee or the board, an external, co-sourced internal audit, so an external party oversees the function for that particular engagement, or any other allocation of staff or resources, as long as safeguards are in place. Next is a new implementation standard, which is the impairment to independence or objectivity. And the new standard states that internal audit activity may provide assurance services where it had previously performed consulting services, provided the nature of the consulting did not impair objectivity, and provided individual objectivity is managed when assigning resources to the engagement. This has always been there. Now it's a new implementation standard. Nothing new there. Standard 1300, Quality Assurance and Improvement Program. The Chief Audit Executive must develop and maintain a quality assurance and improvement program that covers all aspects of the internal audit activity. Now, this quality assurance and improvement program, if you remember, it was comprised of 3 bits: the adequate supervision, internal assessments, and external assessments. Now, the quality assurance and improvement program is designed to enable an evaluation of the internal audit activities' conformance with the standards and an evaluation of whether internal auditors apply the code of ethics. The program also assesses the efficiency and effectiveness of the internal audit activity and identifies opportunities for improvement. Now, the addition to the standard is the Chief Audit Executive should encourage board oversight in the quality assurance and improvement program. So we want board oversight, we want management involvement in this aspect. Now, reporting on the quality assurance and improvement program. In the past, the standards used to specify that the Chief Audit Executive must communicate the results of the Quality Assurance and Improvement Program to senior management and the board. And common sense dictates that the reporting would include certain disclosures. The standards now add or specify these disclosures that must be reported. Disclosures should include the scope and frequency of both the internal and external assessments, the qualifications and independence of assessors or assessment team, including potential conflicts of interest, conclusions of assessors, and corrective action plans. Nothing new here, just specified or documented and mandated what should be disclosed about a quality assurance program. Now, use of conformance with the international standards for the professional practice of internal auditing, indicating that the internal audit activity conforms with the international standards for the professional practice of internal auditing is appropriate only if supported by the results of the quality assurance and improvement program. And the internal audit activity conforms with the code of ethics and the standards when it achieves the outcomes described therein. These are the changes that were done here. Now, standard 1322, disclosure of nonconformance. When nonconformance with the code of ethics or the standards impacts the overall scope or operation of the internal audit activity, the chief audit executive must disclose the nonconformance and the impact to senior management and the board. Managing the internal audit activity. The internal audit activity is effectively managed when it achieves the purpose and responsibility included in the internal audit charter. It conforms with the standards, and its individual members conform with the code of ethics and the standards. They added a last sentence here. It considers trends and emerging issues that could impact the organization. Here's where we talked about in the introduction. We're looking forward-looking. We're strategically positioning the internal audit. We want to add value to the organization. We don't want to just look at feedback. We don't want to audit the past. We want to try to consider trends and emerging issues to help management achieve their strategic objectives and their strategic vision. Now, the internal audit activity adds value to the organization and its stakeholders when it considers strategies, objectives, and risks, strives to offer ways to enhance governance, risk management, and control processes, and objectively provides relevant assurance. Again, we're looking strategically. Now, standard 2010, planning, and what the standard now mandates to develop the risk-based plan. The chief audit executive consults with senior management and the board and obtains an understanding of the organization's strategies, key business objectives, associated risks, and risk management processes. The chief audit executive must review and adjust the plan as necessary in response to changes in the organization's business, risks, operations, programs, systems, and controls. Coordination and reliance. If you recall, the standards used to say or refer to coordination with three parties: the external audit, external oversight bodies, and internal assurance functions or other internal assurance functions. Now what the standard says is not only coordinate, but coordinate and rely when possible. So the standard reads now, the chief audit executive should share information, coordinate activities, and consider relying upon the work of other internal and external assurance and consulting service providers to ensure proper coverage and minimize duplication of efforts. At the end of the day, our job as internal auditors is to add value to the organization. We'd be adding value when we avoid duplication of efforts. Now, interpretation. In coordinating activities, the chief audit executive may rely on the work of other assurance and consulting service providers. A consistent process for the basis of reliance should be established, and the chief audit executive should consider the competency, objectivity, and due professional care of the assurance and consulting service providers. The chief audit executive should also have a clear understanding of the scope, objectives, and the results of the work performed by other providers of assurance and consulting services. Where reliance is placed on the work of others, the chief audit executive is still accountable and responsible for ensuring adequate support for conclusions and opinions reached by the internal audit activity. So if we want to rely on them, we have to treat them like our own staff. We have to make sure that they are competent, independent, objective, adequately supervise their work, and then we can rely on their work. Now, reporting to senior management and the board. And prior to these changes, in various parts of the standards, we were asked to report to senior management and the board. Now, what the changes aim to do is to specify how and what to report in one place. Let's read the standard. The chief audit executive must report periodically to the senior management and the board on the internal audit activity's purpose, authority, responsibility, and performance relative to its plan, addition, and on its conformance with the code of ethics and the standards. Reporting must also include significant risk and control issues, including fraud risks, governance issues, and other matters that require the attention of senior management and or the board. Now, the interpretation. The frequency and content of reporting are determined collaboratively by the Chief Audit Executive, senior management, and the board. The frequency and content of reporting depends on the importance of the information to be communicated and the urgency of the related actions to be taken by senior management and or the board. They specifically specified what needs to be communicated, and this has been collectively or referred to in various parts of the standards. Now, it reads the Chief Audit Executives reporting and communication to senior management and the board must include the following information about the audit charter, independence of the internal audit activity, the audit plan and progress against the plan, resource requirements, results of audit activities, conformance with the code of ethics and the standards, and action plans to address any significant conformance issues, management's response to risk that in the Chief Audit Executive's judgment may be unacceptable to the organization. These and other Chief Audit Executive communication requirements are referenced throughout the standards. Nature of work. The internal audit activity must evaluate and contribute to the improvement of the organization's governance, risk management, and control processes using a systematic, disciplined, and risk-based approach. Internal audit credibility and value are enhanced when auditors are proactive and their evaluations offer new insights and consider future impact. Again, we're aligning the internal audit function strategically. We want to be forward-looking. We want to be proactive. We want to help management. We would like to be the source for management's advice on a regular basis. Governance. The internal audit activity must assess and make appropriate recommendations to improve the organization's governance. Governance processes. For, they added 2 new elements: making strategic and operational decisions, overseeing risk management and control. And they added coordinating the activities of and communicating information among the board of directors, board, external and internal auditors, and other assurance providers and management. So they added the other assurance providers there. Engagement planning. Internal auditors must develop and document a plan for each engagement, including the engagement's objectives, scope, timing, and resource allocations. The plan must consider the organization's strategies, objectives, and risks relevant to the engagement. They just added that phrase over there. Now, engagement objectives. And if we recall, before these changes, when we did not have appropriate evaluation criteria, it was our responsibility to discuss with management and try to persuade them or have them put criteria in place for us to be able to audit. This is what the standard now mandates. Adequate criteria are needed to evaluate governance, risk management, and controls. Internal auditors must ascertain the extent to which management and or the board has established adequate criteria to determine whether objectives and goals have been accomplished. If adequate, internal auditors must use such criteria in their evaluation. If inadequate, internal auditors must identify appropriate evaluation criteria through discussion with management and or the board. And the types of criteria may include internal, such as policies and procedures of the organization, external, such as laws and regulations imposed by statutory bodies, and leading practices such as industry and professional guidance. Engagement resource allocation. Internal auditors must determine appropriate and sufficient resources to achieve engagement objectives based on evaluation of the nature and complexity of each engagement, time constraints, and available resources. Now, they added interpretation there. Appropriate refers to the mix of knowledge, skills, and other competencies needed to perform the engagement. Sufficient refers to the quantity of resources needed to accomplish the engagement with due professional care. So the interpretation is primarily to define both the words appropriate and sufficient referred to in the standard. Now, documenting information. In the past, it was part of the good documentation practices to document sufficient, reliable, relevant, and useful information to support the engagement's results and conclusions. They just put that there in the standard now. So internal auditors must document sufficient, reliable, relevant, and useful information to support the engagement results and the conclusions. Criteria for communicating. Final communication of engagement results must include applicable conclusions as well as applicable recommendations and their action plans. Where appropriate, the internal auditor's opinion should be provided. An opinion must take into account the expectations of senior management, the board, and other stakeholders, and must be supported by sufficient, reliable, relevant, and useful information. And finally, the last change was for the overall opinion. When an overall opinion is issued, it must take into account in addition, of course, it used to be this expectations. Now they added the strategies, objectives, and risks of the organization and the expectations of senior management, the board, and other stakeholders. The overall opinion must be supported by sufficient, reliable, relevant, and useful information. Now with this, we come to conclude the changes that were done or affected to the standards. As you saw, most changes were already there in the various parts of the CIA material or CIA books, and we don't foresee significant changes to your next exam. There might be 1 or 2 questions. We hope that with this short video, you'll be better prepared to answer any questions on these changes for your next CIA exam. We're here to help you pass the exam, and good luck.